in the 1960s. Arlene picked olives in Palestine in solidarity with Palestinian liberation, taught at the University of Havana at a secondary school in Salvador, Brazil, and after Katrina, she worked for the People's Hurricane Relief Fund in a struggle to gain Black people's right to return to their homes after forced evacuation. Most recently, she wrote Operation Ghetto Storm, also known as Every 28 Hours Report, published by the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, as well as several follow-up articles that appeared in Counterpunch, The Root, Washington Post, and Telesurf. She continues to teach, march, organize, write articles in solidarity with the struggle for Black liberation and other anti-imperialist movements. Welcome, Arlene.
I'm too old to stand for as much time as I have here. I want to thank the organizers of this event, White People for Black Lives, the Sierra Club, the Neighborhood Unitarian Universalist Church, and the Black Lives Matter LA movement, and to all those who turn their pain and grief into struggle for justice and liberation. I know we all feel a lot of grief and pain. I also want to encourage you to go here because I'm not going to have time to talk about as many things as I want, and there's a lot of information there. And I wanted to mention that, I better put my glasses on, that the topic of this conversation is why these killings continue, why they persist in the face of all our protests, in the face of the headlines, the national conversations, the commissions, etc. They keep happening, including as recently as after I wrote these notes, reading today about Tom Angel. I think many of you might have seen that. He's a second in command of the LA Sheriff's Department. Check it out in the LA Times. He has written some horrific emails, as well as the killing, or the shooting of a young 14-year-old black man named Dedrick Colvin in Baltimore on the anniversary of the Freddie Gray uprising. They keep coming. Ordinarily, I don't speak about myself, but the folks who invited me here asked me to share a little bit about my experience in the 60s that might give some useful historic perspective on what we're trying to do today. In 1960, SNCC, which was the leading Black liberation organization essentially based in the South, had been before 66, it had been an integrated organization, and in 66, they told the white people who were involved in the organization, we love you, but we want you to organize white people. We don't need you organizing black people anymore. In fact, we don't even want you in our organization anymore. And this is what Charlie Cobb, who was a SNCC field secretary, told the Students for a Democratic Society convention in 1966. White people must challenge the basis of this society's existence, black slavery and Indian genocide. These things have to be exposed and overturned in the white community. Stop cheerleading us as we face billy clubs, arrests, and even assassinations. You've got to risk your lives too. To speak to the hecklers, to take on Klan supporters, to show poor whites that their own freedom would only come from allying with Black Power movement. As she mentioned, I worked on the Panther newspaper, and most of us in those days ended up organizing against the war in Vietnam. That was the war that led to our understanding of imperialism. That is, what we learned was that the war was not not simply a product of the Republican or the Democratic administrations. It wasn't the foreign policy of LBJ or Goldwater or Nixon, that it was integral to the system that defined and exploited oppressed people both inside and outside the U.S. I was part of the New Left movement that openly advocated, as Dahlia was mentioning today, taking direction from those who were leading the struggles against imperialism, namely the Vietnamese people and black people, especially the Black Panther Party. And one of the quotes from Assata Shakur, which maybe isn't as common, has been repeated a lot in demonstrations these days, I think summarizes what I'm talking about. She wrote, "Any community seriously concerned with its own freedom has to be concerned with other people's freedom as well. The victory of oppressed people anywhere in the world is a victory to Black people. Each time one of imperialism's tentacles is cut off, we are closer to liberation. Imperialism is an international system of exploitation, and we as revolutionaries need to be internationalists." I think that's as true today as when she wrote it. Some, including me for 2 years, got factory jobs in order to organize white workers. That didn't work out very well. Eventually, personally, I spent a good part of the 70s trying to build an anti-imperialist women's movement. And I can talk in more detail later about that if you like, but I'm going to continue. So fast forward a half a century nearly to Operation Ghetto Storm. It was essentially prompted by the 6-week campaign that was necessary to get George Zimmerman charged. And it was, as many of you may remember, it had to be a really heavy national campaign just to get this one vigilante charged with the murder of Trayvon Martin. This struck a chord with many of us as the mother of a Black child and all parents of Black children. It's our nightmare. You send a kid to the store for Skittles or whatever, and he never comes home. In a conversation I had with a comrade from Malcolm X grassroots movement, we were talking about some of the problems of the movement then, where the focus was so exclusively on Trayvon's murder, you could almost think of it as an isolated instance. And the arrest of Zimmerman was the end goal of the movement. And we talked about how it was important to counter that narrative. And so I asked him, has there been any study of the number of killings like this? And he didn't know any. And I said, I had some free time. So I said, okay, I'm gonna do it. And actually the first report was the first quarter, that same quarter that included Zimmerman. And I became obsessed with the project. And after more than a year of 18-hour-a-day clicking, I collected the information that's in that report and presented it. And it ended up being 170 pages of details of how 313 Black people had been killed by police, security guards, and vigilantes. Some of those details are summarized on the slides you'll see, and I'm not going to read you statistics right now. But before I do that, before proceeding, I wanted to digress a little bit on the issue of credibility, legitimacy, and corporate press when we look for our information. And so many of us are just stuck with the corporate press and don't know where else to look. In the spring of 2013, when this report first came out, we sent press releases everywhere. Basically, the report was ignored. report. Then, after Ferguson, and that was about a year and a half later, when a lot of folks in the streets picked up on the hashtag every 28 hours, and you started seeing it on posters and leaflets and graffiti and newspaper articles and speeches. Finally, the corporate press started paying attention. It wasn't the report they were paying attention to, it was what people were saying in the street. And what was their reaction? Their reaction was to debunk it, to minimize it, to say, this can't be true. And that is traditionally the response of white supremacist institutions, to deny the existence of the problem. But because this had become so-called viral, PolitiFact and Washington Post each did their own fact check and ended up giving it 4 Pinocchios, total lie. And recommended that we use the FBI data instead. Now, within a few months, they realized, but not then, and by the way, I've never gotten an apology, that the FBI data underestimated the problem by some ridiculous percent, and that the one form that impunity for police takes is that their reporting still is voluntary, absolutely voluntary. And so most departments don't bother, or they send in lies. It's not standardized. So a few months after Washington Post published this hit piece, really, they committed 60 staff people to a project of collecting data because they finally realized that the FBI wouldn't help. Still, after 60 people working a year and receiving a Pulitzer Prize for their work, by the way, their data is less reliable because, number one, they rely entirely on police department press releases, and number two, they only include killings by police by shooting. So that excludes, as you know, Eric Gardner, who was choked to death, and people who were tasered, Freddie Gray, who was beaten to death, and on and on. There are also 2 other databases, one that the Guardian newspaper does, which is a little better than the Washington Post, and also one that Mapping Police Killing does, which is that of some Black Lives Matter folks at Stanford. And I think you're behind on the slides. Okay, this is the one I need. It's very wordy for a slide, but basically the point of the slide is that the numbers haven't changed. You have to, each database collected varies methodologically, slightly different definitions, who they talk, and so on. But if you calibrate that, and remember, I only focused on Black people. I was one person, and I was working for Malcolm X grassroots movement. If I had had a few helpers, we would have done much more. But the numbers of Black people killed basically have stayed the same. So the question is, why? Why hasn't there been supposedly an improvement now that the country's attention has turned to the problem? But first I need to define what I meant, or actually international human rights standards use the term extrajudicial killing. This is killing without due process. And the only time it's legitimate to kill without due process by international standards is to save other lives. Everything else is excessive force, as you see here. So in 12% of my cases, police actually shot someone who was in the process of shooting. No question of maybe this, maybe that, but in the process of shooting. Actually, it was only 8%, but another 4 was debatable, so I included the 12. And then to define the term state sanctioned. State sanctioned means that police are directly authorized by law, underlined law, and paid by the government. Governments at every level, local, state, federal, many federal departments, they have impunity, even from reporting their crimes, and virtually unlimited funding and lots of political clout. They're not just servants of the ruling elite, they become somewhat of an independent power base within the military-industrial complex, which is why many of us talk about we have a police state these days. Security guards and vigilantes are also sanctioned, though their support is weaker. For example, we have the stand the ground laws, your home is your castle laws that allow many killers to get away. And finally, the reason why I included security guards was because many of them are sheriffs who are moonlighting, and when they kill someone, they have the full support of their sheriff's departments behind them. I suspect this Tom Angel, who's second in command of the LA Sheriff's, has justified a few of his moonlighting men on this kind of thing. We called the report Operation Ghetto Storm. Basically, I got the title from something I read, that there had been a police convention a couple of years after Bush 1 invaded Iraq. And you may remember, some of you, that invasion of the first war in Iraq was called Operation Desert Storm. So there was this police convention a few years later where the guys were wearing T-shirts with a ghetto in flame and Operation Ghetto Storm on back of it. So they were transferring their military skills from Iraq to home. And I thought that the name encapsulated the conclusion that the mission, the white supremacist state policies and institutions, the high-tech military hardware, the conqueror's mentality that characterized the invasion of Iraq also sustained the occupation and war on Black and brown communities in the U.S. This has enormous significance. If you think about the institutions responsible for sustaining our overseas wars, it's not much different here. Let me give a quick definition of white supremacy, because a lot of people think of it as exclusively a mindset or an ideology, which it is. But it's also a web of interlocking, mutually reinforcing institutions: economic, political, military, legal, educational, religious, and cultural, that propel a system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white peoples and nations for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. The groundbreaking historian Gerald Horne, who, if you haven't heard of him, I highly recommend reading any of his stuff. He's a professor at the University of Texas, Austin. But Gerald Horne has demonstrated how the United States is and was a settler colony built on stolen land, built with stolen labor. And it was the world's first nation founded in white supremacy. Bringing the analysis to date, there's another professor, Robin Kelly, who's right here at UCLA, who talks about the relationship to the police. In this political and legal system built on ideology and institutions of settler colonialism that make white property rights sacrosanct, The purpose of police power is to discipline, monitor, contain populations that threaten white private property. And of course, the first white private property was the enslaved people of Africa. And the first police forces, as many of you may have heard, were slave catchers. But in addition to the slave catchers, which there's a lot to say about that, I don't have the time. There was something interesting I found called the Lantern Laws in New York. Have anybody heard of the Lantern Laws? 1713, even before independence, there were a series of lantern laws in New York City that said the black body had to be illuminated at night. Any black person out at night had to be carrying a candle. And if they didn't carry a candle, they would be punished. And any white person, not just deputies or whatever they called militia in those days, any white person was deputized to stop any black person without a candle and punish him. I'm not sure how. Probably beatings. This is the precursor to stop and frisk. This is the precursor to Zimmerman. And there are hundreds and hundreds of examples from U.S. history of this sort of thing. Everyone's heard of lynching. Between 1877 and 1950, at least 4,000 black people were lynched. The famous black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, along with Paul Robeson, Harry Hayward, and William Pattison, wrote a report that became a book called We Charge Genocide that talked about the relationship between lynching and police killings. And what they said was, once the classic method of lynching was the rope, now it is the policeman's bullet. This is in 1950. We submit that the evidence suggests that killing of Negroes has become police policy in the United States. And that police policy is the most practical expression of government policy. It's not a question of accident. Force and violence systematically and consistently employed to quell the righteous anger of blacks is justified by calling murder an exercise in law and order. That was in 1950. In 1960, James Baldwin talked about it in a similar vein. The mission of the modern police in New York, the only way to police a ghetto, this is Baldwin, is to be oppressive. Their very presence is an insult, and it would be even if they spent their entire day feeding gumdrops to children. They represent the force of the white world, and that world's real intentions are simply for the world's criminal profit and ease to keep black people corralled up here in their place. The badge, the gun, and the swinging club make vivid what will happen should their rebellion become overt. I'm going to skip a couple of things here. So, in addition to this history, the other facets of state-sanctioned and why this killing continues, how it's systematized, is the outsized political clout of policemen's lobby. They have enormous power as local unions in their state legislatures at the federal level. The message of all the lobbies is the police are heroic public servants who never stray from their duty to protect citizens from criminals, terrorists, and uphold law and order. That's the first aspect of their message. The second one is, police work is extremely dangerous and requires unconditional public, political, and financial support. It requires impunity. By the way, if you look at the data, the totally rare killings of police have been declining. Generally, their message has prevailed. If you Google polls on public approval of police, you'll see the enormous amount of educational work we have to do. And again, as Dahlia mentioned, I think this is one of the primary functions that white people have, because the main people who buy these myths that propagated by police are white people, as these polls show. And there's a slide up there about that. All told, we have 250,000 police in 18,000 police departments spread around the country. New York is the largest, most powerful one. It has 35,000 troops. Mayor Bloomberg bragged at one point that he had the 7th largest army in the world, and that was the term he used, army. One indication of their clout, aside from the fact of their impunity, of all the hundreds of police killings in 2012, only 10 were ever charged, and only 2 were convicted, and those 2 convictions really prove the rule, that they don't get convicted. 70% of police officers who have been terminated had their terminations overturned. And one thing that the Washington Post, bless their hearts, mentioned in a recent article was that 55 killer cops from 2015 alone had killed before. There hasn't been any discipline for the racist cops who write these emails that every once in a while become a big scandal. It's also important to look at who staffs police departments. Doesn't matter what color they are. This is an institutional force, and those who don't share those values become like these New York 12. I don't know if you've seen publicity about the New York 12, but they're Black and Latino cops who went on TV, called the police commissioner a liar, and said that their job is predatory. But that's the exception. There's a revolving door of white supremacists, Army recruits, Army vets, and police. Ajamo Paraka pointed out in a June blog last year that Dylan Ruth, that's the guy who killed the vigilante who killed 9 Black people in South Carolina, that his objective was to take over, quote, his country from Black rapists and criminals, and that this was ideologically consistent with the ideology of U.S. military propagandists. Quote, the irrational, violence-prone, racialized other occupies a permanent space in the consciousness of so many in the U.S., which is why it has been so easy to mobilize public support for U.S. military interventions and campaigns of political subversion from Iraq to Venezuela. And I would add LA, Baltimore, and community of color. White supremacist organizations infiltrate the army and recruits, and you can see this in all their publications. And the return of military veterans from combat correlates closely with the rise in Klan membership. Last year, there were 2.4 million vets of Iraq and Afghanistan. I want to mention something about rape. I wrote a book about Vietnamese that had a chapter about the systemic rape of Vietnamese women by U.S. troops, so I'm tuned into this issue of rape by occupying armies. So like all occupying armies, police departments are organized in rigid hierarchies, infused with patriarchal indoctrination and practice. Rape is standard practice for occupying armies, both to weaken resistance and to motivate troops. The recent exposure of serial police rapes in Oklahoma City and here, Los Angeles more recently, must be a tip of a very deep iceberg. The other facets of this state sanction is the judiciary. Attorneys general follow Supreme Court precedent, which has stated and legalized police force whenever the use is judged, quote, reasonable from the point of view of the officer at the scene. I don't have time right now to detail the utter failure of Department of Justice investigations to make a dent in the problem, but it's in the Telesur article and maybe we can talk about it more afterwards. So what are some of the strategic applications of these conclusions? One thing I want to say, which may be a little bit debatable, is the focus on the unarmed status of targets of police violence, I think is counterproductive and ultimately helps reinforce white supremacy and the myth of the heroism of the police. It almost seemed after Michael Brown was shot that his first name was unarmed. Unarmed Michael Brown, unarmed Ezel Ford, unarmed Brendan Glenn, or Alicia Thomas. But this sabotages our movement because it kind of implies that if they had been armed, it would have been okay to shoot them. And it's not okay. Shooting is extrajudicial. It denies people their right to due process. Besides, the police consistently lie about whether someone is armed. And I have data on that, which I don't have time to go into. And then we have a quote from a conservative pundit named Ben Stein, who said, you know him?
Yeah.
He insisted Mike Brown was not unarmed. He was armed with his incredibly strong, scary self. Before you dismiss this remark as the hate speech of a right-wing fanatic, consider that 47% of killer cops are routinely justified in return to duty when they claim, without a scintilla of evidence, that they felt threatened by the suspect. Another 36% kill with impunity based on their unsubstantiated allegations, like the suspect lunged. But even if cops didn't lie, the overall criminalization of Black and brown people in this society implies that it's okay to shoot them if they are, even if they're not armed. So again, I want to really encourage you, next time you're having a discussion with someone, not to focus so much on unarmed or armed, to think about it as a more comprehensive problem. Marianne Kaba is a Chicago-based Black activist against violence against women and mass incarceration. And she urged people to widen our horizons and stop thinking of justice as the indictment of a policeman. That rather, our concept of justice has to make Black lives free from violence. She also listed a number of reforms we should oppose. Anything that gives police more money, more personnel, or more power, which by the way includes cameras and body armor and all these. Anything that relies on individual dialogue, or changing of the guards. In other words, just a change of personnel isn't going to make a difference. And I have a series of slides here, which you won't, I'm not going to read, but I did a little research on LA police chiefs, and I consider that changing of the guards. I'm not sure how much it helps to get rid of one to be replaced with another of the kind that get nominated in this system. There's two demands that the Chicago Black Lives Matter people have put forth that make a lot of sense to me. We demand community control of all police departments with the creation of an elected civilian police accountability council with the power to hire and fire police officers and superintendents by civilian representatives voted in by each neighborhood with mandated inclusion of survivors of police violence and torture. There's a lot of provisos in here, but it's a way of getting around these police review boards that have been happening ever since the 60s that become rubber stamps of the police departments. And they also called for the redirection of police funding towards Black and brown futures. So I'm going to summarize real quickly. First, body cameras, improved training, reduced military hardware, and other reforms are cosmetic and cannot change the basic state-sponsored violent mission of the police. 2, reliance on the justice system for substantive justice, or even revenge, may lead to community pacification, but won't prevent future violence. 3rd, no president or politician whose election depends on pleasing the captains of financial and military industry will seriously commit to ending Operation Ghetto Storm any more than she or he will end the U.S. empire's military interventions around the world. 4th, given the deep roots and pervasive control of the white supremacist hegemonic narrative, a priority is to educate and organize people block by block. That's what I hope we're encouraging you to do here. And finally, with the recognition that the survival for most of the people of the world depends on defeating the white supremacist imperial project, building international solidarity is essential.
PDF, it's 170 pages. 18-hour days for 365 days, probably more than that. That's some serious business. So once again, thank you so very much, and we look forward to giving you an opportunity to engage in some of those data that we didn't get a chance to in the presentation. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Real quick, and you all know this is a fundraiser, right? So that's the cue for you guys to reach in your pockets, get some pens out, your checkbook. So last time we were here back in December or January, I can't remember exactly when the last one was,